It was a hot Atlanta afternoon when FBI Special Agent Renee Carter, a brilliant and relentless black woman, found herself at the center of something far more sinister than her cartel investigation. Driving back from months of exhausting undercover work, she was abruptly pulled over, despite not speeding. The white officer, cold and dismissive, ignored her badge, her authority, her existence. This wasn't a stop. It was a power play soaked in racism. Handcuffed, humiliated, and thrown into a cell, Renee knew this wasn't about law. It was about control. If you believe truth matters, subscribe now. Renee's fight has just begun. The moment Agent Renee Carter stepped onto that cracked sidewalk outside the precinct, the stale air of injustice hit her harder than any blow she'd ever taken in the field. She had just escaped from the hands of a corrupt officer, Officer Daniels, a man so blinded by his authority and hate, he couldn't see past the badge she held or the decades she fought to earn it. Her wrists were still bruised from the steel cuffs he'd slammed on with a smirk, mocking her status, daring her to speak up. And yet, even in chains, Renee hadn't broken. They'd taken her to that forgotten precinct like they were hiding a secret, because they were. But what they didn't expect was Renee to survive it, remember it, and come back stronger. As Mitchell, the nervous young officer who helped her escape, drove through the dimly lit back streets of Atlanta, Renee wasn't just running, she was calculating. Because what happened to her wasn't new. It wasn't rare. It wasn't a mistake. It was systemic and personal. And now, it was war. Daniels had dragged her into a cell, like she was just another case file to bury, ignoring every law he was sworn to uphold. A black woman in a federal agency wasn't supposed to talk back, wasn't supposed to shine. And when she did, when she succeeded, he made sure to remind her, your badge doesn't protect you here. But Renee never relied on protection. She was a fighter, a strategist, a survivor. She had chased down killers, uncovered human trafficking rings, infiltrated drug operations, but never had she felt so hunted by the very system she swore to protect. Why? Because she didn't fit their mold. Because when a black woman walks into a room full of power and doesn't shrink, some people treat her like a threat. As the city faded behind them and they reached the edge of the Georgia pines, her mind raced. Not from fear, but from focus, but from, "He's not going to stop," Mitchell muttered, eyes darting to the mirror. Renee already knew that. Men like Daniels didn't sleep when they lost control. They plotted. They hunted. But so did she. And unlike him, she had nothing to prove. Just a truth to expose. They found temporary shelter in an abandoned cabin. Dust filled the air, but to Renee, it was freedom. Temporary, fragile, but real. As Mitchell paced, paranoid and anxious, Renee stood silently by the window, watching, waiting, planning. This wasn't just about her anymore. Daniels was a symptom. The disease ran deeper. And if no one stood up, no one would ever be safe. Then, headlights. The sound of gravel crunching beneath tires shot through the silence like a gunshot. Mitchell turned pale. Renee didn't flinch. She grabbed her weapon, not out of fear, but precision. This wasn't over. And when the cabin door burst open and Daniels stepped through, barking her name like he owned the world, she didn't run. She rose. "I'm not hiding," she said, stepping out from the shadows. "You don't get to silence me." He came at her with a baton, snarling, rabid with hate. But Renee was faster. She dodged, countered, struck. The pipe in her hand cracked across his shoulder with a sickening snap, And for a second, just a second, he saw her for what she really was, a reckoning. But it wasn't enough. He lunged again. They struggled. Chaos unfolding in that dark cabin until the sound of sirens split through the tension like thunder in a storm. Backup. Her team. Justice was catching up. Daniels fled into the woods like the coward he was. But he wouldn't run far. The law was finally turning on its own. As Renee sat on the cabin steps, blood on her hands, not hers but his, she stared out into the trees, her breath steady. She wasn't broken. She wasn't scared. She was ready. Ready to file every report, testify on every stand, shine a light on every dark corner of the force that let men like Daniels thrive. She knew it wouldn't be easy. They'd question her, gaslight her, try to twist her words. But she didn't care. She'd spent her whole life being doubted, ignored, dismissed. And she still made it to the FBI. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about changing the game. Renee Carter wasn't going back to work with her head down. She was going back with her head high and her sleeves rolled up. The system cracked open the wrong door when it came after her. Because now she had a name, a story, and a mission. You want to know what happens next? Hit that subscribe button, because Renee's not done yet. Not by a long shot. It was supposed to be just another long day. Special Agent Renee Carter, one of the few black women in the FBI, had been on her feet for over 16 hours. Her mind fogged by the weight of a massive drug cartel case she'd spent months building. Atlanta pulsed in the afternoon heat, but her thoughts were sharper than ever as she drove alone back toward headquarters, piecing together the last fragments of a criminal empire on the verge of collapse. The long hours, the cold coffee, the nights she slept at her desk, the threats that came with investigating powerful men. None of it had deterred her. But it wasn't the cartel that would threaten her the most that day. It was the very system she worked for. The very badge she wore. The color of her skin. As she turned onto a familiar downtown road, blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it might be for someone else. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't swerving. But when the patrol car trailed her aggressively, sirens howling like wolves in the wind, she pulled over, confused. Her training told her to remain calm. Her experience told her something was wrong. She'd been here before. Not like this, but close enough. The way people look at you when you wear the wrong skin in the wrong neighborhood. The way your voice gets questioned just a little more. But she was FBI now. She'd earned that title. Surely that meant something. Officer Daniels stepped out of the cruiser. White, tall, hard-set face like a stone. From the moment he approached her window, hand resting on the grip of his gun, Renee felt it. The tension. The dismissal. The contempt. "License and registration," he barked, ignoring her greeting. "Good afternoon, officer," she replied, reaching for her badge. "I'm Special Agent Renee Carter, FBI." She held it out, expecting the situation to de-escalate immediately. Instead, Daniels barely glanced at it, his frown deepening. "I said license and registration." His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. It didn't matter what her ID said. It didn't matter how many criminals she'd brought to justice, how many late nights she'd spent risking her life for a country that looked past her. All Daniel saw was a black woman. Renee's instincts screamed. She tried to explain, gently, professionally, asserting her authority. But Daniels didn't care. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. When she hesitated, rightfully so, he raised his voice, loud enough for pedestrians to turn their heads. "Are you deaf? Out! Now!" People started filming, whispering, but no one intervened. She complied, slowly, hands visible. But the moment she was out, he grabbed her, shoved her against the car. Pain ripped through her shoulder as he twisted her arm behind her back, metal biting into skin. "Resisting arrest," he muttered with a sneer. "Think your badge makes you special?" The humiliation was unbearable. Cameras were rolling. People watched. And no one said a word. Her knees hit the hot pavement. Her heart thundered. She had faced down cartel enforcers, interrogated killers, been shot at and survived. But this was something else. This was personal. Dragged like a criminal, shoved into a squad car, stripped of her dignity, Renee tried to breathe through the fire building inside her chest. Her wrists bled under the cuffs. Her badge meant nothing. Her name meant nothing. Daniels mocked her in the rearview mirror. "Pretending to be FBI, huh? You people think you're so clever." He laughed, as if all her sacrifice, all her training was a joke. He didn't take her to a main precinct. No, he took her somewhere far, some old, half-abandoned station on the outskirts, somewhere quiet, out of reach. Inside, the few officers barely glanced up. No one questioned him, and the way they looked away when she entered told her everything. This wasn't the first time. Thrown into a dim interrogation room, still cuffed, blood on her wrists, dirt on her knees, Daniels got in her face. "As far as I'm concerned, you're just another mouthy criminal." When she spoke up, voice trembling but strong, he laughed. "You think you're untouchable, flashing your little badge. Well, let me tell you something. You're in my world now." And she believed him. She asked for a phone call, denied. She demanded a supervisor, ignored. Time passed. The pain in her shoulders throbbed. Her jaw clenched against the cold metal chair. But then the door opened. A younger officer, Mitchell, entered. Nervous, hesitant. He said he was processing her. She saw the guilt behind his eyes. She pressed him. Spoke to his conscience. Maybe he could help. But just as hope flickered, Daniels returned, shouting, intimidating. Mitchell folded under pressure, avoiding eye contact. "You still have a choice," Renee whispered as she was led to a cell. "You don't have to be part of this." Hours passed in the tiny holding cell. She stared at the cracked walls, heart burning. This wasn't just racism. It was betrayal. She'd dedicated her life to justice. She'd endured hazing at Quantico, subtle comments about being diversity quota, supervisors questioning her ability to lead. All of it she'd swallowed and worked through. But this was raw, open, violent racism. The kind that no training prepares you for. The kind that comes with fear and fury and tears she refused to let fall. Suddenly, the door clicked. Mitchell again. Pale. Sweating. "I'm getting you out," he whispered. Her heart slammed into her ribs. Was this real? A trap? Could she trust him? But she had no other option. She followed. Through back corridors, past dusty evidence lockers. Then the night air hit her face, sharp, cool, and terrifying. Mitchell's car waited. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," he answered. But nowhere felt safe anymore. As they drove, she called a colleague from a gas station payphone. Jackson. Someone she trusted. "Daniels is dirty," she said. "He's hiding something big. He's trying to bury me." Jackson didn't hesitate. "We're coming. Stay hidden." Relief. Brief. Fragile. Daniels would come for her. He'd lose his badge if this got out. And he'd rather burn the whole thing down than let that happen. They fled to the woods, lost cell reception, found shelter in an old cabin. But Daniels wasn't far. The pain in Renee's body had spread. Bruises from the arrest, a cracked rib she hadn't noticed until her side screamed when she breathed. Her mouth was dry. Her muscles trembled. Still, she refused to break. She checked the windows, held her firearm close. Mitchell paced. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," he muttered. "He's been doing this for years. Everyone's afraid of him." Renee's voice was flat. "I'm not." But Daniels found them. The cabin door slammed open like a war drum. Renee barely had time to react before he lunged. They fought. Brutal. Raw. She used a metal pipe. He came at her with his fists. Her body screamed from every blow. Mitchell tried to help. Daniels knocked him down. Then sirens, finally, backup. Daniels bolted into the trees. As agents stormed the scene, weapons drawn, Renee stumbled to her feet. Her vision blurred. Her wrists throbbed. Her ribs ached. But she was still standing. They took her statement. Arrested Mitchell for protocol. Put out a warrant for Daniels. "You're lucky," one officer said. "This could have gone real bad." She didn't respond. She was too tired. Too angry. Too aware that the only reason she was still alive was because she fought harder than anyone should have just to prove she belonged. Back at HQ, she sat alone in a medical bay, lights buzzing above her. She thought of the woman she saw in the mirror that morning. Neat bun, crisp blazer, proud eyes. Now she was bruised, scarred, but stronger. This wasn't over. Daniels was still out there. And Renee Carter would not rest until every piece of his corrupt past came to light. Because this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was for every black woman who'd been silenced, every badge that didn't protect, every system that turned a blind eye. And if you're reading this, if you believe her story matters, subscribe. Because Renee's not done fighting. She's just getting started. Her name was Renee Carter. Special agent, decorated investigator, one of the few black women in the FBI. And right now, as she stood barefoot in the dark cabin, blood smeared on her knuckles, pain coursing through every inch of her bruised body, she didn't feel powerful. She didn't feel safe. She didn't feel anything but rage, betrayal, and exhaustion so heavy it felt like chains around her soul. How had it come to this? She had fought her whole life just to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. Not because she wanted praise, but because she deserved it. And still, despite the credentials, despite the sacrifice, despite the badge pinned to her chest that she'd nearly died for more than once, none of it mattered. Not to them. Not to Officer Daniels, whose hatred bled through every word he spat. Not to the system that let him pull her from her car like a criminal. Not to the silence of the precinct where no one lifted a finger when she screamed, "I'm FBI!" And now here she was, hiding, hunted, hurting. She'd been through operations that left her mentally shattered and physically scarred. But this wasn't an operation. This wasn't a mission. This was a nightmare born from the very country she served. Her bones ached. Her shoulder throbbed from where Daniels had slammed her into the hood of his car. Her wrists were raw from the handcuffs he had tightened with satisfaction. But it was her soul, her spirit, that bore the deepest wounds. Renee had walked into war zones overseas and gang territories at home. She had faced men with guns, with nothing to lose. She had talked mothers out of vengeance and children out of despair. She had earned her place with sweat, intelligence, resilience, and love for a broken system she believed she could help heal. And yet here in America, in the very city where she was born and raised, her blackness made her invisible, made her disposable, made her the enemy in a uniform. She'd held it together for hours. Through the illegal arrest, through the mocking laughter, through the cell with no phone call, no food, no water, through Mitchell's shaky hands unlocking the cuffs, through the gas station escape, through the panic of hiding in the woods, through Daniels storming into the cabin like death itself. But now the tears came hot and silent, rolling down her cheeks as she crouched near the corner of the dusty room, weapon trembling in her grasp, breath caught between fight and collapse. How much more could she take? And yet, she didn't break. She could have screamed, could have given in, could have let fear win. But she wiped the tears away with the back of her hand, stood up, and whispered to herself, "You're not done, because that's what strength looks like. Not perfection, not silence, but rising. Even when every part of you aches, even when you feel like you're dying inside." Renee Carter rose because she had to. For every little black girl watching, for every woman who'd ever been told to calm down, for every innocent life swallowed by injustice. She rose. For truth. Daniels had something to hide. She knew it. He didn't just hate her because of who she was. He feared her because of what she might uncover. And now, with her on the run, with backup en route, he was desperate, dangerous. But that didn't scare her. No, what scared her was how easy it had been for him to get away with it. How no one in the precinct stopped him. How racism wasn't just about slurs and violence, it was about indifference, about silence, about policies that protected monsters in uniform. That's what broke her heart the most. She glanced at Mitchell, who sat across the room, still trembling, ashamed of the badge on his chest. He had helped her escape. But not because he was brave, because he was scared of what she represented. The truth. The accountability. "You didn't have to help me," she had told him in the car. "But now you do." And he knew it. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Her team was close. But so was Daniels. The man who started it all. The man who could have killed her and called it a mistake. Renee's grip tightened on the weapon. Her knees buckled slightly from the pain radiating through her ribcage. She was sure something was cracked. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to stay upright. She didn't want pity. She wanted justice. And if you're still here, listening, I need you. I need you to feel what she's feeling. I need you to see her. Not as a statistic. Not as a headline, but as a woman who has carried the weight of an entire system on her shoulders and still refuses to drop it. I need you to hit that like button. Not for vanity, but because the more people who see this, the harder it is for the world to pretend this isn't real. Your support, your encouragement, it means something. You are her witness. Because when Daniels returned to that cabin, when his shadow crossed the threshold and his voice echoed off the wooden walls like a curse, "Come out, Agent Carter! You think you can take me down?" She didn't run. She stood. Despite the pain, despite the fear, she stood. And when he lunged again, their second fight wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. His fists against her resilience, his hatred against her truth. The baton he swung missed her head by inches. She struck back with a metal pipe. Not out of rage, but to survive. And when her weapon clattered across the floor, and he pinned her, screaming about power and control, something in her broke and rebuilt itself in real time. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all of us, what we stand for, what we tolerate, what we're willing to fight to change. And then the sirens got louder. Then came the flash of red and blue through broken windows. Then came the backup. Daniels ran, like a coward, like the predator he was. And Renee fell to her knees, not because she was weak, but because she had given everything she had just to make it to that moment, to survive, to tell the story. And now it's on us. Will you help her tell it? Will you comment below and let her know she's not alone? Will you stand beside her in this virtual space and say, "We see you, we hear you, we believe you"? Because Renee Carter may be fictional, but what she went through? Very real. And if you think her story matters, if you want more people to see what strength really looks like this video, subscribe, share her fight, because she's not done yet, and neither are we. No one knew what Special Agent Renee Carter had done. Not exactly. They only knew that by morning, the whispers had already started spreading like wildfire through the FBI field office in Atlanta. The kind of whispers that get quieter when you enter the room. The kind that make people stare a second too long. Her name wasn't just floating in the halls anymore. It was echoing. What did she do? How far did she go? Was it true she crossed the line? No one had the full story, and that's exactly how Renee needed it to be. Because if anyone discovered the truth too soon, it wouldn't just cost her the case. It could cost her everything. But beneath the silence, behind the eyes that watched her every move, there was one truth that burned hotter than them all. Renee had taken an unthinkable risk, and now she was being hunted for it. It had started with a case. At least that's what the file said. A missing informant disappeared mid-investigation, days before testifying against a dangerous organized crime network. The kind of disappearance that screamed inside job, but no one wanted to admit it. Renee did. Because she knew something others didn't. She knew this wasn't just about a missing witness. This was a cover-up. And someone high up wanted that witness erased. So she did what no one else would. She went off book. Quietly. Carefully. But decisively. And somewhere in the shadows, she found something. Something she wasn't supposed to see, and now they were coming for her. The night she vanished. No one saw her leave. Not security. Not her colleagues. Not the cameras. She left her phone on her desk, her gun locked in her drawer, her badge under a manila folder, all by design. Because where she was going, nothing could trace her. She'd spent years cleaning up other people's messes, following orders, doing everything by the book. But that night, she broke every rule she'd sworn to uphold. And the most chilling part of it all? She had no regrets. Now, days later, she was deep in the underbelly of the city. Unrecognizable. Moving in silence, hair chopped short, clothes plain and forgettable. No badge, no backup, no protocol. Only instinct. She had seen the face of the man responsible, the one pulling the strings, and she knew he'd kill her before letting her speak. And if that meant disappearing into the darkest parts of Atlanta to find the one piece of evidence that could expose him, so be it, even if it cost her her name, her future, her life. She broke into places most agents wouldn't even enter with a SWAT team. She intercepted messages, stole files from secured drives, copied surveillance footage, and slipped out undetected, each time just minutes ahead of someone trying to catch her. She trusted no one. She couldn't. The enemy wasn't just some criminal. It was inside the very agency she worked for. Someone with reach. Someone who could erase lives with a single call. But what she had uncovered was too big to keep buried. What was it? That's the part no one knows yet. But whatever it was, it scared powerful men. It made good agents disappear. It made doors close fast when she knocked. And as much as people wanted to believe Renee was just another rogue agent, There was one thing that didn't make sense. Why did she leave behind a note that read, "You'll understand soon enough"? Now Renee was surviving off-grid, sleeping in safe houses that weren't on any map. Using burner phones she swapped every 24 hours, eating from vending machines, wearing fear like a second skin. But every moment she was still breathing was a victory. Every second she stayed ahead of them was another beat in the heart of justice. Because Renee wasn't hiding out of fear. She was hiding to prepare. The storm she was about to unleash, it would tear through everything they thought they controlled. She had names, dates, footage, and a recorded confession. Just not hers. But here's the twist. Renee couldn't go public yet, because if she did, the people she was trying to protect would die. That's the part no one knew. The reason she walked away. She wasn't running for herself. She was running to keep others safe. The witness they said was dead? She found them. They were alive, but barely. Hidden. And if she spoke too soon, if she showed her hand, they'd be gone for real. So Renee had to play this perfectly. She had to stay in the dark long enough to bring the truth into the light, and that meant living like a fugitive, being labeled a traitor, letting the world think she'd cracked under pressure. She carried the weight of two lives, hers and the witness who trusted her. And every hour that passed, the danger grew thicker. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. She didn't call anyone, not even the few people who might have believed her. She couldn't risk it. She moved like a ghost, ate in silence, cried in silence. But her fire? It never died. Because deep down, Renee knew. The truth would set her free, but only if she made it out alive. And that's where you come in. If you've made it this far, if your heart is racing, your breath caught in your chest, your thoughts spiraling with what could she possibly have found, then you owe it to her to speak up. Drop a comment below. Let her know she's not alone, that you believe in her, that she matters, that you're rooting for her. Because every voice that says, "Keep going, Renee," is a light in the darkness she's fighting through. And maybe, just maybe, it's the encouragement she needs to take one more step. So tell us, what do you think Renee discovered? What would make a loyal FBI agent walk away from everything she loved to chase a ghost through the shadows? Comment below. And if you want to know what she does next, subscribe. Because Renee's next move will change everything. There are stories you hear and forget, and then there are stories that wrap around your chest and never let go. Special Agent Renee Carter's story is the kind that steals your breath halfway through and leaves you whispering, "How did she survive?" long after it ends. Because what she went through wasn't just an incident, it was an unraveling. A deliberate attempt to erase her not just from the system she served, but from the world entirely. And when the truth finally came out, the full truth, even the people who once doubted her couldn't look her in the eyes without feeling shame. You see, it all started the day she was pulled over, not for breaking the law, but for breaking a mold that wasn't meant to fit someone like her. She was a black woman in power, an FBI agent who didn't flinch, a force of nature wrapped in calm authority. And that terrified the wrong people. Renee had just wrapped a brutal 3-month undercover operation. No sleep, no backup, just her and her instincts deep inside a drug trafficking ring with federal ties. She was on the brink of blowing the case wide open, with names of corrupt local officers who'd been protecting violent traffickers. She had gathered evidence that, if revealed, would bring down not just criminals, but colleagues, commanders, the very people who wore the badge next to her. And the second she stepped out of that world and into her car, driving back to headquarters to deliver the files, they made their move. Flashing lights behind her. A stop that made no sense. A white officer, Daniels, approaching with a face carved from stone and hatred. "License and registration," he barked. She calmly showed her badge. "Special Agent Carter, FBI. I'm on assignment." He barely looked at it. He wasn't there to check her license. He was there to erase her voice. "Step out of the car," he ordered. She hesitated. That hesitation cost her. What followed was swift and brutal, shoved against her own vehicle, handcuffed with unnecessary force, thrown into the back seat like trash. It wasn't just about silencing her. It was about humiliating her. Sending a message. Daniels didn't take her to a known precinct. He drove her out of the city, to a near-abandoned outpost where oversight didn't reach. There, she was interrogated, mocked, isolated. They took her phone, her badge, her identity. For 36 hours, Renee was a ghost, missing, unaccounted for. No one knew where she was. But even then, she didn't panic. She memorized faces, timelines. She recounted everything. Because if she got out, and she would, she'd make sure every name tied to her abuse would be carved into the record of justice forever. She discovered that Daniels wasn't acting alone. He was part of the very corruption ring she was investigating. He knew who she was. He knew what she had. And this whole setup? It was their preemptive strike. If they could bury her before she spoke, their secrets would stay buried too. But what they didn't know was that Renee had already sent part of her evidence to an off-site encrypted drive. And if she didn't check in by a certain time, it would trigger an auto-send to the Justice Department. She had planned for betrayal. She just didn't expect it to come so soon, or so violently. Or so. By the time Mitchell, a young, uncertain officer, found the courage to help her escape, Renee was bruised, dehydrated, and bleeding from the wrists. But she was also burning with purpose. He drove her out in silence. Neither of them spoke much. She was focused on staying alive. He was wrestling with the guilt of watching her suffer. They hid in motels, back roads, fleeting shadows. Her face was plastered all over the internal agency network, labeled Rogue. She'd gone from respected agent to wanted fugitive in less than 2 days. Not because she did something wrong, but because she knew too much. They hunted her like prey. The FBI, the police, the same institutions she swore her life to. They said she had stolen classified data, that she posed a threat to national security. Lies, all of it. And yet, as the days passed, her name became a stain in the press. Former colleagues whispered, maybe she cracked under pressure. Some said she was working for the cartel. Others said she'd lost her mind. No one asked why a brilliant agent would risk everything. No one asked what she had uncovered that was so dangerous, men in uniform were willing to throw away their careers just to stop her from speaking. And that's the part that breaks your heart. Because Renee heard it all. Every lie. Every rumor. She watched the world flip on her from cheap motel TVs and scratched burner phones. She saw agents she'd mentored call her unstable. Supervisors she'd impressed label her unreliable. But not once did she lose focus. Because this wasn't about image. It was about truth. She wasn't fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the innocent girls trapped in the cartel's trafficking routes. For the dead informants no one ever avenged. For the young black officers who would never rise if the system stayed this crooked. She was fighting for all of us. And then came the moment. She'd been hiding in an abandoned basement downtown, waiting for confirmation that her encrypted files had been received. When her laptop lit up at 2:17 a.m., with a message that read, "Files opened, Investigators assigned, DOJ engaged. She let herself cry. For the first time in years, she sobbed. Not because she was safe, but because they finally couldn't silence her. The evidence had gone out. The names, the wire transfers, the reports, the surveillance footage, the list of every dirty officer in Atlanta tied to the cartel. It was all in federal hands now. She had done it. Broken, bleeding, betrayed. But she had done it. Within 48 hours, 3 senior officers were arrested. Daniels disappeared. An internal affairs investigation launched full force. Her name? Still muddy, still under review. But the tides were turning. And Renee? She stepped out of the shadows, turned herself in, told her story under oath, faced the cameras with swollen eyes and cracked lips, and a voice that did not waver. She sat in front of a tribunal panel and said, "Yes, I broke protocol, but I did it to protect the truth. And if I had to do it again, I would." The room fell silent, and from that moment, the world began to see her not as a rogue agent, but as a warrior. And if you've made it this far, if your heart aches like mine does, if you feel what she felt, you know this wasn't just a story about corruption. This was about resilience, about what it means to fight when no one is clapping, about standing for what's right even when the floor gives out underneath you. Renee Carter didn't ask to be a hero. She just refused to be silent. So now I turn to you, the listener. Leave a comment. Tell her you see her. Tell her you believe her. Tell her she matters. Because there are real Renee Carters out there, right now, being silenced, discredited, erased. But your voice can help bring them back. And if you want to know what happens next in Renee's journey, because trust me, it's far from over, subscribe. This story? This fight? It's just getting started. The air was thick with tension when Special Agent Renee Carter, battle-worn but unshaken, stepped out of the woods with torn clothes, bruises down her arms, and a heart heavier than she had ever known. The forest had swallowed her and spit her back out, not just physically battered, but mentally fractured by a night no one would ever fully understand. She was a federal agent, trained for high-risk assignments, trusted with national secrets, but nothing in her training prepared her for what she had just survived. The media wouldn't report the truth. The headlines would never scream her side. But what Renee Carter endured in the name of justice, and what nearly broke her, is the story the world needs to hear. Because it all started with a traffic stop. One that wasn't about traffic, one that wasn't about a broken law, one that was about breaking her. She had been on the verge of cracking the most dangerous investigation of her career, a case that tied a vicious drug cartel to high-ranking officials. The evidence she gathered, names that reached beyond street thugs and into the command chain of law enforcement, was enough to set off a firestorm. That's why she wasn't surprised when intimidation tactics began. Strange cars parked near her home, her keycard mysteriously deactivated, files disappearing from her encrypted drive. But what she didn't expect, what she never imagined, was that her life would nearly end on a quiet Atlanta street in broad daylight. That afternoon, driving back from a field interview, she noticed flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't on her phone, but still, she pulled over, cautious, curious. The officer who approached, Daniels, looked like he'd been waiting for this moment. The way his fingers hovered near his holster, the sharp tone in his voice, the refusal to acknowledge her badge when she calmly identified herself as an FBI agent. It was all deliberate. "License and registration," he barked. "I'm a federal agent," she repeated, holding out her credentials. He didn't even glance at them. "Out of the car, now." The world slowed. Cars passed. Pedestrians watched. No one intervened. She tried to reason, assert her authority. But in Daniel's eyes, she wasn't an agent. She was a threat. He dragged her out of the vehicle, slammed her against the hood with so much force her shoulder cracked, and handcuffed her as if she were a criminal caught red-handed. She tried to keep her head high, but inside, rage and humiliation warred for control. Her wrists bled. Her lips trembled. Cameras recorded, but not a single bystander stepped in to stop the injustice. Her voice didn't matter. Not to Daniels. Not in that moment. Not with her skin color and confidence threatening the fragile ego of a corrupt man in uniform. He took her to a station she didn't recognize, off the grid, no oversight. A place where dirty cops worked quietly in the shadows. She was locked in a cell for hours, denied water, denied a phone call. Her badge was gone. Her phone confiscated. Every time she tried to speak, Daniels mocked her, his voice like poison. "You think the Bureau's gonna save you?" he sneered. "They'll disown you before sunrise." And maybe he was right. Maybe they already had. But Renee wasn't someone who folded under pressure. No. She took every ounce of pain and used it as fuel. But the worst wasn't the beatings. The worst wasn't the cell. The worst was the silence from the people she once trusted. The officers who walked by without making eye contact. The ones who whispered and laughed outside her cell. It was clear. Daniels wasn't working alone. And Renee, despite her rank, her record, her years of sacrifice, was expendable. A problem to be erased. And still, she didn't give up. She watched. She listened. She waited. Then came Mitchell. Young, nervous, not fully corrupted. When he entered the room to process her, she saw the fear in his eyes. Not of her, but of Daniels. She spoke to that fear, pressed it, challenged him to do the right thing. "You know this isn't right," she said, her voice soft but strong. "You know I don't belong here." Mitchell didn't answer. Not then. But something changed in him. A crack in the armor. And when he returned later that night, sweat on his brow, keys trembling in his hand, Renee knew she had only one chance. He unlocked her door, told her to run, and without another word, she followed. They fled the precinct under cover of darkness. No plan, no backup, no safety net. Just the two of them driving into the unknown. Renee's shoulder throbbed with every bump in the road. Her hands shook, but she refused to show weakness. She needed to find a place to regroup. A payphone to call Agent Jackson, her only ally left. When she did, breath ragged from sprinting across a gas station parking lot, she could barely speak. "They tried to bury me," she gasped. "But I've got the files, the proof, and I need help." Jackson promised to send a team. But until then, Renee had to survive. They fled into the woods, abandoned their car, found shelter in a dilapidated cabin. The floor creaked. The windows were cracked. But it was the safest they could find. Every sound outside could have been Daniel's. Every gust of wind could have carried his footsteps. They stayed awake all night, her with a pipe in hand, Mitchell too scared to speak. She was exhausted. Starving. Her ribs felt broken. But when morning came, she was still breathing. And that, she told herself, meant she was winning, until Daniels showed up. The door slammed open. His shadow filled the cabin. And for a second, Renee froze. The man who had tried to strip her of everything. Her dignity, her badge, her life, stood just feet away, smirking like the devil himself. "You thought you could run?" he hissed. "You thought anyone would believe you?" She didn't answer. She struck first. The fight was brutal. He hit her hard. She fought back harder. Every blow was a scream for justice. Every bruise was a mark of her defiance. Mitchell tried to intervene. Daniels shoved him aside like a rag doll. But just before Daniels could deliver a final blow, sirens split through the woods. Jackson's team. Backup. Daniels fled like a coward. And Renee collapsed. She woke in a hospital 2 days later. IV in her arm. Monitors beeping. And Jackson at her side. "We got the files," he said. "We know everything. You were right." Tears filled her eyes. Not from relief, but from release. It was finally over. The files she had hidden. The surveillance she'd captured. The recordings. The witness. It all led to a multi-agency investigation. Daniels was arrested weeks later, caught trying to cross the border. Several officers were indicted. Mitchell resigned, his statement exposing everything that happened in that precinct. But Renee, she returned to work, bruised but unbroken. The system tried to erase her. Racism tried to define her, but she refused to vanish. She gave testimony, held press conferences, spoke at rallies, and every time she walked into a room, heads turned, not because of what she endured, but because of who she had become. A symbol, a survivor, a woman who wouldn't let injustice win. And now, she needs you. Yes, you. If you're still here, if you felt her fear, her pain, her courage, drop a comment. Let Renee know she's not alone, that you stand with her, that her fight wasn't in vain. Every word of encouragement matters. Every voice counts. Tell her you believe her, that her story needs to be told again and again. Because Renee Carter's story isn't just fiction. It's a mirror. And what you see in it might just change the world. It's hard to explain what it feels like to give your life to justice and then be treated like a criminal by the very system you swore to protect. But that's exactly what happened to Special Agent Renee Carter, a woman who had given years, sweat, blood, and every ounce of her integrity to the FBI, only to find herself face down on the pavement, her wrists bruised, her pride shattered, and her name twisted into something ugly by those who never believed she belonged there in the first place. And if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, pushed aside for being different, then her story will feel like it was written in the language of your soul. Because Renee didn't just fight criminals. She fought institutions, mindsets, centuries of bias baked into every raised eyebrow when she walked into a room wearing a federal badge and confidence they weren't ready to see in a black woman. She didn't want to be a symbol, she just wanted to do her job. But the day they tried to silence her was the day she became something bigger than herself. It started like any other afternoon. She was returning to her office after wrapping a grueling undercover operation that had kept her neck deep in a violent drug ring for months. She was exhausted, hungry. Her shoulder ached from a chase gone wrong the night before, but her mind was sharp, replaying the final piece of evidence she needed to close the case. As she turned down a familiar road in downtown Atlanta, blue lights flared behind her. Confused, she slowed down. She hadn't been speeding. No illegal turn, nothing that warranted being pulled over. Still, she complied. She always did. The officer who approached, Daniels, had that look. The one she knew all too well. It wasn't about the law, it was about power. The moment he saw her skin, her badge, and her confidence, he decided she was a problem. "License and registration," he barked. She calmly explained who she was, showed him her FBI credentials. His lips curled into a smirk. "I don't care if you're the president. Step out of the car." The fear didn't hit her immediately. It was the disbelief that came first. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not after all she had given to the Bureau. But Daniels didn't stop to think, or question, or process. He reached for her, yanked her from the driver's seat, slammed her against the vehicle so hard she saw stars, then slapped cold metal cuffs on her wrists like she was some street thug. And the worst part? People watched. People filmed. But no one stopped it. No one stepped in for her. She was dragged into the back of a squad car, her wrists screaming from how tight the cuffs were, her voice hoarse from demanding to speak to a supervisor, her dignity stripped layer by layer. And it wasn't until she realized where they were going, not a main precinct, but some old satellite station on the outskirts, that the panic really set in. She had worked too many cases, seen too many things to miss what this was. It wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. Daniels and others like him had been on her radar for months. She had proof that dirty cops were protecting cartel activity, and she was close. Too close. And now, instead of being praised for the case she'd built, she was being processed like a criminal in a building where no one asked questions, where rules disappeared, where her screams bounced off walls and were swallowed whole. She spent hours in a locked room, ignored, alone. No phone call, no food, no backup. The cuffs left bruises on her wrists, and her body throbbed with pain from how violently she'd been handled. But it was her heart, her sense of justice, that took the deepest hit. How had it come to this? How could a woman who had once stood at podiums giving briefings, who had led raids, who had recruited and trained agents, how could she be reduced to a suspect just like that? Then came Mitchell. He was young, hesitant, scared. He was supposed to process her, fingerprint her, log her, complete her erasure. But something in her eyes must have made him hesitate, something in her voice. She told him the truth, begged him to listen, to remember his oath, to remember why he wore that uniform. "You know this isn't right," she told him, "and if you let this happen, you're a part of it." His hands shook, his breath caught, but he didn't answer. Not then, hours later, when the station was quiet and Daniels had gone to gloat in private. Mitchell returned, with the keys. And together, they ran. She didn't even remember how they got out. The fear was too loud, the adrenaline too thick. She had no badge, no weapon, just the clothes on her back, a battered body, and a head filled with the names of the men who had tried to bury her. They fled through the city, switched cars, slept in shifts, hid in shadows, until they reached the woods and an old abandoned cabin that offered more questions than safety. She'd seen the way Mitchell looked at her, like she was a ghost, a story he didn't believe could be real. But it was real, and he was now part of it. She managed to call a trusted colleague, Agent Jackson, from a payphone, gave him the basics. Enough to send backup, but not enough to know she was barely hanging on. Her body was failing. Her breath was shallow. Her shoulder had dislocated during the arrest. Her side was swollen and bruised. And yet, she didn't rest. Couldn't, because Daniels was hunting her. And then, he found them. The door to the cabin exploded open like thunder. Renee barely had time to grab a metal pipe before Daniels lunged at her. The man who had arrested her like a dog was now in her face, snarling, weapon raised. He hit her. She hit back. It wasn't just a fight. It was a war. She fought with every ounce of pain, every drop of betrayal, every second of humiliation carved into her skin. Mitchell tried to help but was thrown aside. Renee was left to face her nightmare alone. She nearly passed out from blood loss, from fatigue, but she didn't fall, Because right before Daniels could finish what he started, sirens cut through the night. Backup had arrived. Daniels fled into the woods, and Renee collapsed on the cabin floor, gasping, crying, breaking, but finally free, and she was taken to a hospital, her injuries documented, her story finally believed. The files she had hidden before the arrest were recovered. Her evidence triggered an investigation that rocked the precinct. Daniels was eventually caught. The ring she'd been uncovering was exposed. Officers were arrested, careers ended, and slowly, painfully, Renee Carter's name was cleared. But it came at a cost. She still has the nightmares, the pain in her shoulder that never went away, the weight of knowing how close she came to being another statistic, another silenced voice. But when she walks now, she walks taller. Not because she's unafraid, but because she fought through hell to stand at all. And if you're here, if her story touched something in you, let her know. Hit that like button, not just for the algorithm, but for Renee. To say, I see you, I hear you, I believe you. Drop a comment to remind her, and every woman like her, that her fight mattered, that her voice matters. Because Renee Carter didn't just survive. She changed everything. And if you want to see what she does next, if you're ready to keep following her fight, subscribe. Because stories like hers, they're not over. In the end, Special Agent Renee Carter didn't just reclaim her name. She redefined what it meant. After everything they did to her, after the wrongful arrest, the bruises that lingered long after the wounds had healed, the betrayal by the very system she'd sworn to protect, Renee didn't disappear. She didn't retreat into silence or fade into obscurity. She rose, stronger, louder, unshakable. When the dust settled and the investigations were complete, Daniels was stripped of his badge and sentenced. The precinct that protected him was dismantled piece by piece. Renee's evidence, painstakingly gathered and nearly erased, became the foundation of an internal reform initiative that swept across the state. And Renee? She stood before a room of reporters and lawmakers, the same way she once stood in interrogation rooms and briefing halls, with calm, commanding truth. I didn't survive this for revenge, she said, voice steady. I survived it so no one else has to go through it alone again. The room was silent, not from disbelief, but from awe. Because everyone now knew what it had taken for her to make it to that microphone. Not just strength, not just intelligence, but something far deeper. Unshakable faith in what's right, even when the world turns against you. But Renee's story isn't just about injustice or redemption. It's about something much more universal. Resilience. It teaches us that the real battles are often fought in silence, behind closed doors, when no one's watching, and everything inside you says, give up. It teaches us that the truth might get buried, but it never stays buried forever. And it reminds us that you can be the most prepared, the most educated, the most respected, and still be reduced to nothing in someone else's eyes just because of who you are. But here's the thing. You are never just what they see. You are every choice you make to rise, to speak, to keep going. Renee's fight may have started with handcuffs and ended with handshakes, but the scars she carries are real, and they tell a story the world needs to remember. That standing up for justice won't always make you popular. It won't always be safe. But it will always be worth it. Because change doesn't come from comfort zones. It comes from people like Renee, who risk everything to drag truth into the light. So what can you take from her story? Maybe it's this. Don't let fear silence you. Whether you're fighting for yourself or someone else, your voice matters. Stand for what's right, even if you're standing alone, because you won't be alone forever. Let Renee's courage remind you that even when the system tries to crush you, even when people doubt you, even when your pain is invisible, you still matter. You're still powerful, and someone somewhere needs your strength to keep going. And if this story moved you, if you felt her pain, her fight, her fire, let her know. Drop a comment below to tell Renee she's not alone, that her story reached you, that you see her. And not just her. Every woman, every voice, every person who's been silenced, sidelined, or underestimated because of who they are. Say something. It matters. Like this video to lift Renee's voice even higher. Comment to stand with her. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders. Reflections. Fuel for the next time life tries to knock you down. Renee Carter didn't just make it through, she made it count. Now it's your turn. Let her story light your path. And be ready. Because more stories are coming. And they just might change your life.